It's always a pleasure to create stories for you. I feel very happy. Please subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and activate the bell for more videos. There's a peculiar kind of silence that exists in old houses. The kind that hums beneath the floorboards and lingers in the dust motes, drifting through beams of light. It's the silence of lives once vibrant, of laughter that once echoed in hallways now long quiet. And in one such house, tucked away in the countryside beneath the canopy of time, a young woman found herself confronting that silence. Broom in hand, hair tied in a messy bun, sleeves rolled up, ready to clean out her grandparents' attic. It wasn't her idea. Not really. She had been sent by her mother to help prepare the house for sale after the recent passing of her grandmother. The house had stood for nearly a century, each room filled with relics of a life lived slowly and meaningfully. It had been years since she'd stepped foot inside, and now, in her mid-20s, she was beginning to see the house not just as a place from her childhood, but as a museum of secrets no one had thought to ask about. She hadn't expected to feel anything. She was here for a task. Clear out the attic, box what's important, and discard what's not. But memories have a funny way of ambushing us, don't they? The attic door creaked open with resistance, as if the very wood were reluctant to unveil what it had hidden for decades. Dust rose in soft clouds as she climbed the narrow staircase. Old furniture loomed like sleeping ghosts, and boxes were stacked high, labeled in faded handwriting. She pulled open the first lid, revealing yellowing photo albums, stacks of vinyl records, and an old typewriter whose keys still clacked with a hesitant kind of pride. She moved from one box to another, brushing off cobwebs and smiling at forgotten relics. A Polaroid of her mother in a party hat, a faded scarf that still smelled faintly of lavender, a wedding dress wrapped in plastic, never worn. And then, in the corner beneath a cracked leather suitcase, she saw a small wooden box, not locked, but clearly stored with care. The brass latch was cold beneath her fingers as she opened it. Inside was a single envelope, cream-colored, heavy cardstock. It was pristine despite the years, tied with a ribbon the color of aged rose petals. She turned it over. The name written in cursive across the front made her pause. She didn't recognize it. The handwriting wasn't her grandmother's. It was elegant, with delicate loops and graceful strokes. Practiced and full of intention. Below the name was an address. No postage, no stamp, no sign it had ever been mailed. She hesitated, then opened it. The paper inside was just as refined. It was a wedding invitation, dated exactly 30 years ago to the day. The names of the bride and groom were printed in gold script, and one of those names, the bride, was her grandmother. She sat back, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. Her grandmother had been married once, of course, to her grandfather. That much she knew, but this invitation bore the name of another man as the groom. A man no one in the family had ever mentioned. A man whose name felt foreign and yet somehow significant. Why would her grandmother have written a wedding invitation for a ceremony that never happened, and then hidden it in the attic? And why was it never sent? The envelope had no return address, no message, no clue. Just a name, a date, a ghost of something unfinished. For the rest of the afternoon, She tried to focus on her task, but her mind kept drifting back to that envelope. That name, that date. She brought the invitation downstairs, placed it gently on the kitchen table, and stared at it like it might whisper secrets if she waited long enough. Later that evening, she called her mother, casually, carefully. She asked if her grandmother had ever been engaged before meeting Grandpa. No, her mother replied without hesitation. Not that I know of. Why? The young woman didn't mention the invitation. Not yet. Something in her told her to hold on to it a little longer. There was a mystery here, and it felt personal. Like a story waiting just for her to find it. That night, sleep came late and restless. Her dreams were full of music she didn't recognize, of dancing in a room lit by candlelight, of someone whispering her name, but not her name. A name that sounded like it had been borrowed from someone else's past. The next morning, with coffee in one hand and the invitation in the other, she opened her laptop and typed the man's name into a search bar. The search results were sparse. A few mentions in old directories, one blurry photograph from a community newspaper archive. An article about a local violinist who used to play in the city park decades ago, and then, finally, a more recent article from a small-town newsletter. The man's name, a picture, white hair, kind eyes, living alone in a coastal town about 2 hours away. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She didn't know what she was hoping to find, or even why she cared. But something deep inside her whispered that this wasn't just about the past. It was about something left unresolved, and she was the one who had stumbled upon the thread. And maybe, just maybe, she was meant to follow it. The next day, she packed a small overnight bag, tucked the invitation into a notebook, and got into her car. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. It felt too strange to explain. The road stretched out before her like a ribbon into the unknown. Fields rolled past. Trees flickered by, and as the town approached, she felt something tighten in her chest. A fluttering, fragile thing that felt like both dread and anticipation. She arrived just before sunset. The address from the article led her to a small cottage near the cliffs. The garden out front was full of wildflowers. Wind chimes danced in the ocean breeze. She stepped up to the door, raised her hand to knock, and paused. What if he didn't remember? What if he was angry? What if this was just a story she'd built in her head? She knocked anyway. Footsteps. The door creaked open. He was older than in the picture, of course, but his eyes were exactly the same. Warm, curious. And when they landed on the envelope in her hand, they widened. His lips parted. For a moment, he said nothing. And then, barely above a whisper, he said, "You found it." There are moments in life when time seems to bend, when the present stretches its hand toward the past and something invisible, almost divine, makes contact between two lifetimes. Standing in front of the man who had just whispered, "You found it," she felt as though she had crossed into such a moment, one that didn't belong solely to her, nor solely to him, but to a memory they were both just now stepping into. She stood frozen on the porch, unsure if she should speak first. The invitation, once pristine and mysterious in her hands, now felt fragile, like the final thread holding together two versions of history that had never been allowed to meet. The man's name was Theo. Theo Carmichael. He stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. She did so wordlessly, guided more by instinct than reason. The air inside his cottage smelled faintly of cedarwood and sea salt. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dog-eared novels and yellowing sheet music. A violin rested on a wooden stand near the window, and beside it, stack of handwritten letters bound together with a piece of twine. She sat down as he prepared tea, his hands moving slowly, carefully, as though he had done this same routine 1,000 times. When he placed the cup in front of her, he finally asked, "Where did you find it?" She cleared her throat. "In the attic of my grandparents' house. Among some old things I was helping clean out the place." He nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer, or something close to it. "My grandmother's name was Eleanor," she said, watching his face carefully. "Eleanor Grace." He closed his eyes and smiled, a soft, broken smile that carried the weight of 3 decades. "I called her Ellie," he said quietly. For a long moment, they both sat in silence. Outside, the ocean whispered against the cliffs. Inside, the past began to unfurl itself like pages in a forgotten journal. "She never told anyone about you," the young woman said gently. Theo gave a small, sorrowful laugh. "I suppose she wouldn't have." That chapter was closed rather abruptly. He looked at the invitation again, running his fingers along the edge of the paper. "I wrote that the day before the wedding, we were supposed to send out the final batch of invitations together, but she never showed up. No call, no letter, nothing." His voice trembled at the memory, but not from anger. It was the ache of a man who had never quite stopped waiting. "I went to her apartment. It was empty. Her things were gone. The landlord said she'd moved out that morning. She left no forwarding address, no explanation, just gone." The young woman was stunned. "But my grandfather, she married him not long after that, didn't she?" Theo nodded slowly. "Yes. I found out through the newspaper. Maybe 6 months later. She was married, and it wasn't to me." He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. "I kept the invitation. I told myself that if it ever found its way to her, if she ever wanted to explain, maybe it would bring her back. But it never did, until now." The young woman stared at the invitation, trying to reconcile the image she had of her grandmother with the one now being painted by this stranger. A woman who had been in love, engaged to another man, and then vanished from that life without a trace. "She was quiet," the young woman said, "always kind, always generous. But sometimes she seemed far away, like she was still looking at a window that no one else could see." Theo's eyes filled with something close to gratitude. "That sounds like Ellie." She pulled out her phone and opened a photo. One of the few digitized from the attic. It was a snapshot of her grandmother in her 20s, hair curled, eyes laughing. She turned the screen toward Theo. He stared at the image for a long time. Then he reached for a drawer in the table beside him and opened it. Inside was a black and white photograph, older but unmistakable. Eleanor in the same pose, wearing the same dress, only this one had a handwritten note on the back. "To my Theo, June, always." He handed it to her, and for the first time, she felt the bridge forming between generations. A truth long buried, gently resurfacing. Later that evening, she sat across from him as he shared story after story. The way they met at a music recital, how she had tripped walking into the concert hall, and he had caught her before she fell. Their first kiss under a weeping willow by the lake. Their shared love of poetry. Their plans for a future filled with music and art and long Sunday mornings. She wanted to open a bookstore, he said with a chuckle. She dreamed of naming it the Lantern Room, said it would be a place for people who'd lost their way. She always loved stories, the young woman whispered. I know. As the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows crept along the cottage walls, a question began to form in her mind. One she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. Do you have any idea why she left? Theo hesitated, then shook his head. I've asked myself that every day for 30 years. I've come up with 100 possibilities. Maybe her parents pressured her. Maybe she got scared. Maybe she thought she wasn't good enough for the life we planned. But I never knew, and I never will. He looked at her then. Really looked, unless you do. That night, she stayed in a small inn near the shore. The room was quiet, but her mind was not. She lay awake, watching the moonlight paint silver patterns on the wall, her thoughts racing. She had a photograph, a name, a letter that was never delivered. And now she had a mission. Back at the house the next morning, she returned to the attic. This time, she wasn't cleaning. She was searching. For what exactly? She wasn't sure. But she believed, deep in her bones, that the answers were here. Box after box, folder after folder, old journals, stacks of handwritten letters, recipe cards, music programs. Then she found it, a small diary wrapped in fabric. The handwriting was unmistakably her grandmother's. She opened it to a page marked with a pressed violet. June 3 pre-day, the date of the wedding invitation. And on that page, a single paragraph. Trembling, uncertain, emotional. I love him. I always will. But I cannot bring this secret into our life. I've made a mistake that cannot be undone. To leave is the only way to protect what's already been broken. He won't understand, but someday, I hope, someone will. The words were vague, the context unclear, but the emotion was undeniable. Her grandmother had loved Theo deeply. And yet, some secret had driven her away from that love. The young woman read the entry over and over, heart pounding. Then she turned the page and found more. What she read next would change everything. How many years must pass before waiting turns into forgetting? And how many memories must fade before the heart finally stops hoping? For Theo Carmichael, the answer was never. He had waited, not with flowers in hand or bags packed at the door, but with the kind of patience only someone with an unfinished story can understand. His life had moved forward. Of course it had. Jobs came and went. Seasons shifted. His hair turned silver. He made friends, played his violin at city events, and volunteered at the local school. But a part of him tucked in the quiet corners of his soul had never left the altar where he once believed his life would begin with Eleanor Grace. He never married, never even tried. People asked, some speculated. Some even assumed he preferred solitude, but the truth was simpler and more complicated than any assumption. He had loved her. And when she disappeared, when the wedding that was planned with so much care simply evaporated, he didn't know how to start again, because the beginning was always supposed to be with her. And now, 30 years later, A stranger had arrived at his door, holding the very invitation he had once penned, with trembling hands and a hopeful heart. But she wasn't just a stranger. She was her granddaughter. When the young woman her name was Lily returned to his cottage the next morning, she held in her hands the diary she'd found in the attic. It was weathered and soft at the edges, its pages yellowing but intact. She placed it on the kitchen table between them, gently opening it to the page marked with the pressed violet. Theo didn't speak. He just looked at the entry, eyes scanning every word as if they were written just for him. When he reached the final line, he won't understand. But someday, I hope someone will. He slowly looked up at Lily. That someone, he said quietly, is you. Lily exhaled, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of the paper. She was carrying something. A mistake, she said. Something that she believed would destroy what you had. Theo nodded, his gaze steady. The only thing that ever destroyed us was silence. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment. She was always afraid of hurting people, even as a young woman. She carried burdens she never had to carry. I told her over and over, love isn't fragile. It's resilient. But I think she believed she had already broken it before it had even begun. Lily hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph, one she hadn't shown him yet. It was from the attic to a portrait of Eleanor, visibly pregnant, standing beside a man who was not Theo, but her grandfather. Theo froze. The silence thickened. He stared at the image, his hands trembling slightly as he took it from her. His mouth opened, then closed again. Lily whispered, "She left because she was pregnant, and it wasn't yours." The room felt colder, somehow, and smaller. Theo's eyes filled with something Lily couldn't quite define: shock, grief, understanding, and something deeper. Not rage, not betrayal, but the ache of someone who had finally been given the last piece of a puzzle too painful to complete alone. "I see," he said, barely audible. Lily continued gently. She must have realized the timing didn't make sense. Maybe she got scared of what you'd think. Maybe she didn't want to start your life together with a lie, so she chose the only thing she thought she could do: disappear. Theo stared at the photograph for a long time. "I would have raised that child as my own," he said finally, without hesitation. "If she had told me, I would have stayed. I would have loved them both." Lily nodded. I think she knew that. Eventually, but by then, it was too late. They sat in silence again, not awkwardly, but reverently. Two people bound together, not by blood, but by love lost and found in the unlikeliest of ways. Theo stood and walked toward a small cabinet. From inside it, he retrieved an old cigar box. He opened it and pulled out a stack of letters, all addressed to Eleanor Grace, all unsent. He handed them to Lily. "I wrote her every year on the day we were supposed to be married," he said. "I never had an address, never mailed them, but I wrote them anyway, just in case someday someone would read them." Lily's throat tightened as she took the stack. "I think you're the person they were meant for," he added softly. That afternoon, they sat by the sea and read each letter, one by one. 30 years of love frozen in time. Some were hopeful, others heartbroken. Some spoke of music and memories. Others were confessions of guilt for not trying harder to find her. But through them all, one thing was consistent. He never stopped loving her, not once. That evening, Lily stood on the porch of the house that had started it. All the house her grandmother had filled with secrets and silences. She looked out at the horizon, the last of the sun disappearing behind the hills. She didn't have all the answers, and maybe she never would, but she had found something more valuable than certainty. She had found truth, and Theo, he had found peace. The next day, Lily brought him back to the house one last time. Together, they walked through each room. Theo didn't say much. He simply ran his fingers across the furniture, the walls, the windows, as if trying to memorize every shadow. They returned to the attic. He looked around, then turned to her. "Do you believe in second chances?" he asked. Lily smiled gently. "I do now." And then she handed him something. A new envelope. Cream-colored, elegant, addressed to no one. And yet, to everyone. Inside was a single card. Not an invitation this time, but a letter from Lily. It was a thank you note. "Thank you," she wrote, "for loving her grandmother so deeply. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for showing that even after 30 years, love doesn't have an expiration date. Some loves don't end. They fade, yes. They fall into silence. They drift like music played in another room, but they do not die. And when they return through letters, photographs, or the trembling voice of a man still waiting, those loves stir something deeper than memory. They awaken unfinished dreams." Lily never thought of herself as someone who would be caught in the middle of a decades-old romance. Yet here she was, standing between two Tamilans, the life her grandmother had built and the life she had left behind. Theo's truth had opened the door to a version of Eleanor she had never known, a woman full of passion, uncertainty, and quiet sacrifice. And now, armed with the diary and the letters, Lily was beginning to understand that her grandmother hadn't simply chosen one man over another. She had chosen to carry the burden alone. But why? Why would a woman who loved so deeply, who left behind a man like Theo, never speak of it again? Not to her husband, not to her daughter, not even to herself. It seemed Lily believed there had to be more. And the answers, if they existed, would be found only in the details. The days that followed were filled with discovery. She returned to the attic again and again, sifting through everything Eleanor had ever touched. Music boxers, sketches, notebooks half filled with poetry, some written in a voice Lily didn't recognize. They were raw, emotional, full of longing and regret, but it was an old shoebox buried behind a row of suitcases that offered the next clue. Inside, tucked beneath a velvet scarf, were letters. Not from Theo, but from another name. A man named Richard, the man Lily had grown up calling Grandpa. But these letters were not romantic. They were stern, even desperate at times. They told of a troubled relationship, of guilt, of confusion. One even hinted at a confrontation. "You promised to raise her with me. You promised we would move past what happened. I can't do this alone, Eleanor. Please don't leave us now." Lily read those words over and over. Her breath hitched as realization settled in her chest like a stone. There hadn't just been fear. There had been a choice, a painful, possibly coerced one. Eleanor had been caught in a situation far more complex than a love triangle. She had been pregnant by Richard, but in love with Theo. And somewhere in between that emotional chaos, a decision had been made that changed the course of all their lives. Lily didn't know the full truth yet, but she was beginning to sense the shape of it. And it broke her heart. That night, she met Theo at his favorite spot, the cliffside bench overlooking the sea. She handed him the letters from Richard, watched as he read them in silence. When he looked up, his eyes were glassy, but calm. "I always knew it had to be something big," he said. "She wasn't the kind of woman to run from her heart, but this changes things." Lily nodded. She stayed with him, raised a family, but she wrote poetry in journals she never shared. She kept your letters hidden in a drawer. She listened to music she never danced to anymore. Theo looked out over the horizon. The ocean was still. The sky brushed in ember and rose. She lived in two worlds, he said. One of duty and one of dreams. He turned to Lily. "And you're the bridge between them." Lily didn't return home for several more days. She spent those days with Theo walking the beach, visiting the market, listening to him play the violin. There was something incredibly healing in those moments. Not just for Theo, but for herself. It was like meeting a piece of her own history she hadn't even realized was missing. They began to read the letters aloud together, his and hers. The diary entries, the fragments of poetry Eleanor had written in moments of longing. Every word revealed more of the woman they both had loved, in different ways. Eleanor had written of shadows and mirrors, of parallel lives, of the wedding that never was. She wrote about Theo's eyes, the violin, the way he used to hum when he thought no one was listening. One poem was particularly haunting. "I hear your name in the trees, though I planted none with you. I see your face in a dream, but I wake to someone else's view." Lily had to stop reading halfway through. Her voice cracked. Theo placed a hand over hers. "I never blamed her," he said. "I just wanted to understand, and now, finally, he did." There was one final moment of truth still to come. The last letter in Eleanor's diary was dated the year before she died. It was not addressed to Theo. It was addressed to Lily, handwritten, folded, and never delivered. Lily opened it with trembling fingers. "My darling girl, if you're reading this, then something has brought you to a part of me I never dared to show. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps fate, or perhaps the past has finally come looking for its voice. If that is the case, I hope you hear it. There is a love I left behind, man whose eyes I still see when I close mine. I gave up that love because I believed I had no right to it. I made a mistake once, and from that mistake, a life was born, a life I cherished. A family I protected, but I never stopped wondering if I chose wrong. Sometimes I think love must be sacrificed for stability. Other times, I think stability means nothing without love. The truth lives somewhere in between. You are the best of both worlds, Lily. You carry my dreams and my decisions. My hope is that you live freely, that you love bravely, that you never carry silence like a stone around your neck, the way I did. And if you ever meet Theo, tell him he was never forgotten. Love, always, Eleanor." Lily folded the letter and held it to her chest, her eyes full of tears, her soul full of clarity. She had come looking for answers. What she found was a woman, flawed, complex, and full of feeling, who had made an impossible choice, and a man who had chosen to love her anyway. The next morning, Theo played one last song for her. Not just for Eleanor, but for Lily. It was a melody Eleanor had once hummed to herself while writing in the garden. Lily recognized it from old home videos, just a tune in the background, unnoticed by most. But now, it held new meaning. As the notes danced into the morning air, Lily closed her eyes and listened, not to the music alone, but to everything that had once been unsaid. The echoes of a vanished love, finally finding their way home. There are stories we inherit without knowing. They lie dormant in the corners of old houses, tucked away in journals, forgotten photographs, or in the breathless pause before a truth is finally spoken aloud. We carry them unknowingly in our gestures, in the people we choose to love, and sometimes in the ache we can't explain. Lily now understood that she had been walking within such a story all her life. What began with a forgotten wedding invitation had become a journey between two lifetimes. One belonging to her grandmother, Eleanor, and the other now shaping her own. But something unexpected had begun to happen. Somewhere along the way, Lily's search for answers had become something more profound. She wasn't just uncovering the past, she was feeling it, living it. As if the emotions Eleanor had once buried had never disappeared, only waited for the right soul to bring them to light again. And now, they pulsed in her chest like they were her own. In the weeks following the discovery of the final letter, Lily remained in Theo's small seaside town. She wasn't ready to go back to her former life yet. Not until she understood the full shape of the story she had fallen into. During the day, she visited the town's library, combing through archives and newspaper clippings. She spoke to local residents who remembered Theo and Eleanor from a different time. A time when they were young, laughing, always seen together at the annual music festival or walking hand in hand through the gardens near the river. An elderly bookseller remembered Eleanor vividly. She came here once, years ago, the woman said. Long after she left town, she didn't stay long. Just walked the aisles, holding a book on music theory. She didn't say a word. But her eyes, I swear they looked like they'd already said goodbye to something they never wanted to let go. Lily clung to stories like these. Every fragment built the picture a little clearer. At night, she and Theo would sit on the porch, sipping tea in silence, or talking about things that no longer felt like they belonged to the past. The line between memory and presence was blurring, as if her grandmother's love story wasn't finished, just paused. It was on one of those quiet nights under a sky full of stars that Theo said something that stayed with Lily. She told me, once, that time is like a thread running through fabric. Sometimes it frays, sometimes it tangles, but it never truly breaks. We just lose sight of it for a while. He looked at her. You're the thread. Now, it didn't make sense immediately. But in the days that followed, the weight of his words began to settle around her shoulders like a mantle. It wasn't just about finishing a story, it was about continuing it. Living it differently, perhaps, but with the same depth of heart. Lily began to feel things shifting inside herself. She'd come to this place believing she was just organizing her grandparents' attic, checking off a box on a long to-do list. She hadn't planned to find a stranger from the past. She hadn't planned to cry over letters from a man she'd never met. She certainly hadn't planned to feel the deep pull of connection every time. Theo played the violin, a melody that made her chest tighten, as though her soul was remembering something her mind could not name. And yet, it was happening. She was beginning to wonder if stories ever truly belonged to just one lifetime. One afternoon, while exploring an old photo studio in town, Lily stumbled upon a discovery that sent chills down her spine. A roll of undeveloped film, marked with the year 1995. The same year, Eleanor had briefly returned to the town. With permission, the shop owner helped develop the film. There were only 6 photos. The first showed Eleanor standing near the ocean cliffs, staring into the horizon. The second was of Theo's cottage, taken from a distance. The third was of a music hall, long since closed. The fourth showed a bookstore. Not one that existed now, but one that had once stood proudly in the center of town. The Lantern Room. It had existed, after all. Even for a moment. The fifth photo was of a small plaque nailed to the bookstore's door. For stories unfinished and hearts still searching. And the final photo was a picture of Theo, taken from behind as he played violin in the park. Eleanor must have taken it without his knowledge. Lily brought the prints back to Theo. He stared at them for a long time, and then he wept. Not from pain, but from recognition. "She came back," he whispered. "She came back and never told me." Lily nodded. Maybe she couldn't bear the idea of disturbing the peace you had made for yourself. Or maybe she didn't trust herself to leave a second time. Theo held the final photo to his chest. Or maybe, he said, she just needed to see if the thread was still there. The next morning, Lily walked along the cliffside path, the wind tugging gently at her coat. In her hand, she held a new letter, one she had written herself. It wasn't to Eleanor, it was to whoever might come after. There was once a love so deep, it never spoke its name again. It lingered in doorways and handwritten notes. It whispered in music and drifted across time like the scent of a forgotten flower. This is the story of a woman who left and a man who waited. But more than that, this is the story of how even the quietest kinds of love can echo across generations. We are never too far from the ones we've lost. And sometimes, all it takes is an unopened envelope to find our way back to them. She placed the letter in a small wooden box, then tucked it into a hollow beneath the old willow tree Theo had described so many times. The place where he and Eleanor had shared their first kiss. She didn't need to mark it. Someone would find it when the time was right. That was the nature of threads, of stories. They always find their way home. Later that evening, Lily packed her bags. It was time to return, not because the story had ended, but because it had changed her. She hugged Theo tightly. He placed something in her hand before she left. A small velvet pouch. Inside was a silver locket. When she opened it, there were 2 photos inside, one of Eleanor and one of Lily. "I've waited 30 years, Theo said, but now I know. It wasn't just for her. It was for you." Love doesn't always arrive when we expect it. Sometimes it comes early, sometimes it comes too late, and sometimes if we're very lucky it finds its way back in an entirely different form. Through someone else, through time, through silence broken by courage. For Theo and Eleanor, their love had never truly ended. It had paused quietly, hidden beneath years of duty, fear, and choices made for the sake of others. But it was never gone. And for Lily, the granddaughter, who stumbled upon their forgotten story, that love had become her own turning point. She hadn't just delivered an invitation that was never mailed. She had accepted it. Not to a wedding, but to a truth that changed everything. When Lily returned to her city, she was different, quieter, more thoughtful. Banasa. She carried within her a sense of peace she couldn't quite explain. It was like walking with someone else's memories tucked gently beside her own. A sense of being part of something much larger than her own life. Her apartment, once cold and impersonal, felt warmer now. The locket Theo had given her hung beside the window, catching the sun in the afternoons. The letters were kept in a box beneath her bed, and her grandmother's journal sat beside her morning tea. But more than that, something inside Lily had shifted. She began writing again. Not essays, not emails, but stories. Long, winding, emotional narratives that followed characters through impossible choices and unexpected reunions. Stories of silence broken, of letters found, of second chances taken. And she began to live differently too. One day, weeks after her return, Lily found herself at a flea market. It was the kind of place her grandmother would have adored. Full of forgotten things waiting for new hands. She wandered the stalls with no intention of buying anything. But near the back, tucked between a broken clock and a stack of sheet music, she saw it. A stationary set, cream-colored, with rose petal accents, identical to the one used for the invitation she had found in the attic. She picked it up, held it in her hands for a long time, and then she bought it. That night, at her desk, she sat down to write a new invitation. But this one was different. It wasn't to a wedding. It was to a beginning. You are invited to rewrite the past with compassion, to carry forward what was left undone, to remember that love is not a straight line, a thread that curves through time, through people, through generations. You are invited to live bravely, to ask the questions that scare you, to follow the echoes of vanished love until they become music again. And above all, you are invited to begin. She didn't mail it. She didn't have to. She placed it in the same wooden box that held her grandmother's old fountain pen, a dried violet, and one of Theo's letters. A personal time capsule of love reclaimed. A month later, Theo wrote to her a letter in his familiar, careful script. Dear Lily, since you left, I've found myself smiling more. Not because I've forgotten what was lost, but because I now understand what was found. You gave me back something I never thought I'd hold again. The truth. I've started playing music in the square again. The same bench, same time. I even added Eleanor's song to my repertoire. And something curious has happened. People have started gathering again, not to listen, but to feel. It's like the town is remembering her too. I think the story is still being written. Not just mine, yours too. If ever you want to play your part in it again, the door is always open, with gratitude beyond words. Theo. Lily read it 3 times, and then she booked a train. She arrived at dusk. The air smelled of sea, salt, and lavender. The same wind chimes hung from his porch. The same flowers bloomed in his garden. When she knocked, he opened the door without a word, as if he'd known she was coming. She handed him something, a new invitation, written on that same rose petal cardstock. He opened it slowly. You are invited to the final chapter. A chapter not of endings, but of peace. A chapter where stories are not buried, but lived. Let's build a lantern room. Theo looked up at her, stunned. She smiled. we still have time." And they did. That summer, Lily and Theo began the process of restoring an old storefront in the heart of town. The one where the lantern room had once stood for a brief, unspoken season. They built it exactly as Eleanor had described it in her diary. Walls lined with books, soft music playing overhead, a corner for handwritten letters left by strangers, a table by the window for those waiting to be found. They filled it with candles and worn-out armchairs and pieces of the past repurposed for the present. It became a space where love lived in the pages, and silence was always welcome, but never final. People began to visit. At first, just locals, then others. People who had stories of their own. Lost letters that never arrived. Postcards returned, unopened. Some cried, some smiled. All left changed, and on the back wall, framed behind glass, hung the original invitation, the one that had never been delivered. Beneath it, a plaque. This was never mailed, but it still found its way. Years later, when Theo passed peacefully in his sleep, Lily hosted a celebration, not of death, but of love. People read aloud his letters. The violin played one last time, and at the end, Lily read her own letter. "You waited, Theo, not in sorrow, but in love. You believed that unfinished stories deserve to be continued, and you taught me that the things we think are lost never really are. They are simply waiting for us to listen." This bookstore is not a monument. It is a promise that even when invitations are forgotten, love always finds another way to arrive. Lily kept the lantern room open for many years. She lived above it in a small apartment filled with music and stories. Children came to hear fairy tales. Older couples came to remember. Writers came to finish things they thought were too late to begin again. And every Friday, Lily would light a lantern in the window. Not for advertising, but for memory. For Eleanor, for Theo, and for every person who once believed that their story had ended, only to discover that sometimes the final chapter is actually a beginning. End of story.